day for a ball game, and a nice crowd out here to see the Yankees making their last appearance at Navin Field for 1934. We hope before the ball game gets over that Babe Ruth gets in it. I'd like to see Babe take one more swing this season. But his leg is pretty sore. He takes a bit of batting practice, but not very much. Charlie Horse is better, but still not cured. That's why he's out of today's game. The pitch is high. Ball one. Broker the batter.
What you just heard is the earliest surviving recording of a complete Major League broadcast from September 20th, 1934, in Detroit, between the Tigers and the Yankees, with announcer Ty Tyson, who we'll talk about later in the show. This broadcast is 91 years old. Just wrap your mind around that. And I'm going to do the thing I love to do, which is trace generations to take in the scope of what this means. What you just heard was listened to by people who definitely fought in the Civil War. People who heard this broadcast live in 1934 could have been alive during the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. People who listened to this broadcast may have been alive and may have even known Abraham Lincoln, Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, and James Madison, the fourth president of the United States. But to me, it's equally fascinating to focus on the people directly involved in this game. From the perspective of a historian and or baseball fan, how cool is this? The oldest complete baseball broadcast. And Ty Tyson is talking about how much he wants to see Babe Ruth come out for one last at bat. Because this is it, Ruth's final season as a Yankee. But Ruth has a sore leg, and he doesn't get into the game. He does make his final appearance 10 days later. But as we're listening to Ty Tyson, we get to hear the words, the voice, the emotion of this man from 91 years ago, hoping to see Babe Ruth one more time. I can't help think about famous people like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Queen Elizabeth. We have information about these great people, and we even have some descriptions of how they talked, how they sounded. But we'll never know exactly how they sounded. So it's incredible to hear people's voices from nearly 100 years ago, what words they used, what accents they had, and the ways they talked that fit their times. Tonight, we'll hear more from Ty Tyson and a few other early broadcasters. And we'll focus on the story of the man who walked into a radio station, an opera singer, and walked out one of the most influential men in the history of sports broadcasting. From historic milestones
That's it! Holy cow! A strikeout gets his 300th career win, and I tell you, this is...
to euphoric moments shared by millions.
In a year that has been so improbable, the impossible has happened.
To the simple banter that brought us together.
Yeah, it's foul. Malachi with the call. I love that name.
It's a good name.
When you and I have a child together, we should name him Malachi.
Welcome to the Midnight Library of Baseball, Season 4, the broadcast that raised us, from radio to television and beyond. I'm Ben Orlando. The best stories are the ones that turn into movies in your mind. And that's what happened when I read the story of Graham McNamee, an opera singer who completely changed the face of sports broadcasting. This story starts off strange and gets stranger. To begin, in 1923, Graham McNamee is 35 years old and pursuing a career in opera. Apparently, he'd done some solid performances, but he still hadn't come close to making it. And he was 35. This may seem young today, but in 1923, the average life expectancy of an American was 57.6 years. And as far back as tracking goes, women usually live 4 to 6 years longer than men. So that 57.6 years becomes 54 or 55. In fact, McNamee would die at the age of 54. So in 1923, he's 35, trying to make it as an opera singer. And one day he finds himself in downtown Manhattan for jury duty. It's a spring day in May, and McNamee's on a lunch break wandering the streets when he passes this large crowd standing outside the AT&T building, listening to a broadcast from radio station WEAF. Back in the early days, radio stations often piped their broadcast out to the street. It created a buzz and promoted the station. And today, the broadcast piqued McNamee's interest. He walked into the station and happened to run into the station manager, Sam Ross. Maybe McNamee realized the potential of the new invention because he asked Ross if there were any openings for singers. No, Ross told him, but Ross didn't dismiss this stranger who appeared out of nowhere. Apparently, he liked the sound of McNamee's voice because he told him there was an opening for a staff announcer, paying $3 a day. Now, this right here is one of those moments. Say no and walk out the door. Continue your career as an opera singer. Continue doing what you're familiar with, what you've trained for years to do. Or say yes and jump into the abyss. Because for McNamee, radio was an abyss. It was brand new. It was this great unknown. But for some reason, McNamee says yes. He puts his singing career on hold and enters this new, exciting, and terrifying world of radio. And again, he's 35 years old, and he's starting over. According to biographer Court Vitti, quote, early radio announcers worked gruelingly long hours, performing a laundry list of duties around the station. Jobs included general maintenance, answering phones, chauffeuring celebrities, and improvising to fill airtime, end quote. So, in an age where men on average live 54 to 55 years, McNamee at 35 changes careers and steps onto the lowest rung of the radio ladder. But maybe McNamee's age worked in his favor because he already had poise and maturity. And as it turned out, he was only at the station a few months when, in August, he's assigned to cover a major boxing match. And then a few weeks later, he's assigned to broadcast the biggest fighter in the world, Jack Dempsey, fighting against Luis Firpo. Remember, at this time, the two biggest sports in America are baseball and boxing. And this Jack Dempsey fight had an in person crowd of 60,000, plus hundreds of thousands listening on the radio. And then, just like that, Graham McNamee is chosen to broadcast the 1923 World Series. Pretty crazy. This guy is still, for his time, pretty old, struggling to make a career out of singing. And just like that, he's cast into the highest rungs of announcing. I kind of see radio at this time like the dot-com boom. If you're smart or lucky enough to jump in, you get to ride this rocket all the way to the moon. Although, even though radio is small, there must have been hundreds of other broadcasters. Why this new guy who's been in radio for half a year? According to author Gerald Nachman, McNamee's, quote, magnetic voice and dramatic flair were tempered with an easygoing personality that set him apart from the mellifluous voices that dominated the microphones of the 1920s. End quote. So, this might explain why he rose through the ranks at his station as fast as he did, and also why he beat out broadcasters at other stations for this primo gig, the World Series. But one other trait people would soon discover about Graham McNamee was his penchant for exaggeration, which we'll come back to in a minute. Now, McNamee was not the main broadcaster for the 1923 World Series. In fact, he was supposed to be a minor player, someone to add a little spice to the main broadcaster, Grantland Rice. Grantland Rice, up to this point, was mostly known as a legendary newspaper columnist, but he'd been assigned to broadcast the 1922 World Series by baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And he was assigned again for the 1923 Fall Classic. But as a broadcaster, Rice was seen as somewhat lacking. Here's journalist Court Vitti's description of Grantland Rice as an announcer. Quote, "A man of few words, Rice spoke in a slow monotone, devoid of any excitement or enthusiasm. His habit of taking frequent breaks to allegedly rest his voice produced extended periods of dead air silence." End quote. Isn't it amazing how so many extremely important tasks are delegated so thoughtlessly? Here you have Commissioner Landis, who's familiar with Rice as a writer, not a speaker. So he thinks, well, Rice should do the broadcast. And Rice, as a speaker, is boring. But he's also a baseball institution. So he comes back for the 1923 World Series, except now he's paired with this new guy, Graham McNamee. It seemed like at least some people knew that Rice was dull because they brought McNamee on board to add a little color. But mostly it would be Rice doing the talking. Well, after 2 World Series games and 4 innings of the third, Grantland Rice supposedly was so boring that he grew tired of listening to himself. So he completely handed over the reins to Graham McNamee. And history was made because McNamee went off. He talked about the game. He talked about the fans. He talked about the birds that flew by and the clouds in the sky. He talked about the guy who just tripped over his chair and the celebrity in the third row. He seemed to understand what was needed and what had been missing from the start. Banter. He later said, quote, "You must make each of your listeners feel, though miles away from the spot, that he or she too is there with you in the press stand, watching the pop bottles thrown in the air, Gloria Swanson arriving in her new ermine coat, McGraw in his dugout, apparently motionless, but giving signals all the time." End quote. After the 1923 World Series, more than 1,700 letters arrived at the radio station for McNamee. Commentator Jack Brickhouse puts this number into context. Quote, "First of all, there weren't that many radios around then, and for one guy to be swamped like that, today you're talking hundreds of thousands of letters, minimum." End quote. Graham McNamee talked and talked and talked through the 1923 World Series and through many games and seasons to follow, to the point that in 1929, a reporter was captured on a live feed shouting, quote, "McNamee, will you please pipe down?" End quote. But while McNamee was talking, he was also exaggerating or stretching the truth. As legendary sports writer Ring Lardner put it, quote, "There was a double header yesterday, the game that was played and the one McNamee announced." End quote. According to Court Vitti, quote, "McNamee freely admitted to being an entertainer first and a broadcaster second." End quote. But my question is, why? Why would you have to stretch the truth? Why would you have to lie when there's so much around you to report on? I think the answer is that for all his innovation and disruption of the way broadcasting had been, McNamee still didn't have the skills of future broadcasters. And he wasn't a baseball guy. He didn't have those years of knowledge to draw on. To be a good broadcaster while speaking the truth, you have to have a great memory. You have to be able to synthesize information, to weave together the past with the present, to segue from Babe Ruth at the plate to a great story about Babe Ruth that then ties into Lou Gehrig, who happens to be the next guy up. As a broadcaster, you're constantly alternating between calling a play, going deep into the nuances of the game, and telling a good story. And sure, McNamee could have done research, could have learned about each player and their history and the nuances of the game, which I'm sure he did to a degree. But he felt comfortable stretching the truth, creating stories on the spot to entertain hundreds of thousands of listeners. And since he received mostly praise, why would he change it? McNamee went on to broadcast the next 12 World Series. But the 1934 series was the last for him because of his drinking, his divorce, and his remarriage to a woman 20 years his junior. Commissioner Landis, a stickler for upholding the sanctity of the game, removed McNamee from the 1935 series. And McNamee would never call another baseball game. He died in 1942 at the age of 54. Like a comet, McNamee appeared out of nowhere, and just like that, he was gone. He went from a man with no radio experience at the age of 35 to a baseball broadcaster at the top of his game 6 months later. And he stayed at the top for 11 years, paving the way for generations of future broadcasters. It seems like a short period, 11 years for an entire career. But what would you choose? 30, 40 good years? Or 11 groundbreaking, paradigm shifting, unforgettable years as the standout among your peers? That was Graham McNamee. But here it is, the origin story of the modern day commentator. And it was this format, begun by McNamee and stylized by thousands who followed, that brings us back to the title of this series. These are the pioneers, the grandfathers and great-grandfathers of the broadcasters who raised us.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Graham McNamee, your Universal Newsreel talking reporter. The people of Cleveland certainly are to be congratulated. This fine...
Hi, everyone. So, I have a new Extra Innings episode and an interview coming out in a few days. Both are connected to the story of the 1987 Salt Lake Trappers. Maybe you've heard of them, probably you haven't. But the Trappers in 1987 broke the record for most consecutive wins for a professional team with 29. But this story is great because of who these players were and how they defied the expectations of everyone. So check out Extra Innings number 10 and my upcoming interview with Kellen Ikegami, who directed the documentary called The Streak. As always, I really appreciate your support. If you haven't, please add a review or rating to iTunes and become a member of Patreon or donate if you can. Okay, back to the show. In a 1978 interview, former President Gerald Ford said, quote, "I watch a lot of baseball on the radio," end quote. Now, author Eldon Ham thinks this was probably a slip of the tongue on Ford's part. But even if Ford wasn't being cheeky, what he said was a profound reflection. Because when people listen to baseball games on the radio, they also saw the games in their minds. From Ham, quote, the visual imagery of radio provided the perfect platform for a thoughtful team game built on timing, careful strategy, and essential intervals. End quote. When he talks about intervals, Ham compares it to music. In music, he says, you need the rests. And this is true in drama and fiction. After a lot of action, you need those breaks for readers to take a breath, or you need that space to build the suspense. I know I made a point about how the silence was killing radio and baseball early on, but some silence is great. And announcers like McNamee painted a vivid image with just enough details to get you going. Fans closed their eyes. They listened to McNamee, and whether they were standing in their kitchen or living room or next to 100 other people crammed into an appliance store, they were also sitting in the bleachers at the Polo Grounds or at Wrigley Field. This kind of experience had never existed in the history of the world, and it was a precious commodity. But one important tweak was yet to be made, and it was a big one. After McNamee, other announcers followed suit, except they didn't talk like McNamee, who was formal, more of what you think of as a kind of stereotypical radio man voice of the 30s and 40s.
In keeping you abreast of the times, Universal Newsreel pledges utmost cooperation in getting news pictures to this screen while the news is still hot.
But then men came along like Hal Toten of Chicago, who had more of a folksy, down-to-earth feel.
Crowd gives him a hand. Boy, he took a smash that time. Mama, I don't want that to hit me. Woo. My foot had gone right off with it. The foot would have gone into center field and the ball into right.
Later, a man named Dizzy Dean would come along and completely rock the foundations of what was seen as formal broadcasting. But by 1924, it wasn't just the World Series. It was the regular season now that was being broadcast. And this is where baseball found its groove with radio. You had local, folksy announcers like Tot, and it wasn't just describing a sport, it was storytelling. And it didn't just have to be for the masculine male, it was for women and children too. Iconic commentator Red Barber said that early promoters of radio and baseball, quote, grasped immediately that radio turned a game played by two teams into a contest involving personalities who had hopes, fears, families, troubles, blue or brown eyes, end quote. In a way, the sport didn't matter at all. Like Shoeless Joe author W.P. Kinsella said, baseball was simply a vehicle for telling a good story, for plumbing the depths of humanity, and radio was an amazing tool in providing this service. Now, this notion of sports writing as storytelling had certainly come through over the last 30 years in newspaper sports columns, and it came through a little through the telegraph. But radio was different. Radio brought an immediacy, a sitting on the front porch feel that made a broadcast an intimate experience. And over time, broadcasters like Graham McNamee, like Red Barber, like Mel Allen and Dizzy Dean learned to pick and choose the best human stories on the field to create the most connection to fans, to create the most suspense and drama. But it wasn't just baseball. Broadcasters talked about the things happening around the game, and sometimes the things happening to themselves in their personal lives. They made everything interesting. A young peanut vendor accidentally dropping his box. A man in the outfield holding up the letters of a Yankee sign, except it was misspelled. A bird that flies onto the field, distracting the first baseman. Solid commentary of the game is what brings people to the broadcast. But it's the descriptions of these other things in a home-style voice that turns the experience into something else. Now, even though McNamee opened the door to broadcast banter, it still took a while for the idea to become the norm. Even into the 1930s, many broadcasters were still only reporting the action on the field. And as I mentioned before, some teams, like the St. Louis Browns, prohibited broadcasters from engaging in banter. And what better example of the slow transition of banter in broadcasting than the earliest known recording of a full baseball broadcast? This is the broadcast we listened to at the beginning of the episode. And I'm going to let this play a little longer just so you can get a feel for what a broadcast from 1934 sounded like. And again, this is Ty Tyson broadcasting for the Detroit Tigers.
Dandy day for a ball game. And a nice crowd out here to see the Yankees making their last appearance at Maven Field for 1934. We hope before the ball game gets over that Babe Ruth gets in it. I'd like to see Babe take one more swing this season. 2-2 it is. The windup starts again. Here's the pitch. Ball 3 inside. The crowd said oh, a couple of O's. 3-2. You may hear them owing. Three and two it is. Lazari the batter. One man out, nobody on. Here comes the pitch. Lazari grounded to short. Rogel has it. There's the throw. He's out. Rogel to Greenberg. 2 out and none on.
You can go to YouTube and listen to this full broadcast. I mean, it's really cool just to jump around, listen to Tyson talking about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and other Yankees and Tigers of the time. But here, as you're listening to the broadcast, you can hear that dead air. There's a lot of dead space as Tyson talks. From time to time, he mentions the crowd. He gives a little background on what's going on with the hitters, the players. But mostly, he talks about the game, and in between, he says nothing. So the transition is still occurring, and in many cases, we still don't have the kind of broadcasting that we're familiar with today. But whether it's Graham McNamee narrating a novel with his broadcast, or Ty Tyson giving a more bare bones account of the game, all of these broadcasters became part of the family in millions of households across the country, from Brooklyn, New York, to Oakland, California. Think of how much fans loved players like Ruth and Gehrig and Hornsby. But the relationships with broadcasters was different. These men weren't performing any miraculous athletic feats, but they were creating much deeper connections. They were the storytellers of ancient times who sat in the middle of the campfire, the whole village coming out to listen to their tales. Now, the village was connected by hundreds and thousands of miles of radio waves. For the first time in history, people across rivers and mountains and valleys were listening to the same cultural phenomenon at the same time. And there were other major events of the day broadcast through radio. Jack Dempsey fights, college football games, famous trials like the Scopes Monkey trial and the Leopold Loeb murder trial of 1924. But these were singular or short events. Baseball had, at this time, 154 games. That's hundreds of hours of storytelling and deep emotional connection. By the late 1920s, storytelling on the radio, linked to baseball, was about to get a whole lot crazier. That story and more in episode 3. Now we have a listener baseball story from Dennis in Virginia.
I was born in 1946, so I'm a baby boomer, and I started playing Little League Baseball in 1955. Back in those days in Iowa, we were kind of sheltered. My parents were not wealthy, so my dad couldn't afford to take me to baseball games in Chicago or Kansas City or St. Louis. So I relied a lot on the radio and the TV to get my baseball fix each week. So it was something to look forward to on weekends. And I got into it pretty much in 1960 when I started following the Pittsburgh Pirates. And Roberto Clemente was my favorite player. They made their pennant run that year. And I got into radio listening in the late 50s, early 60s, throughout the 60s. Sometimes we'd use those old tube radios from back in those days. Those tube radios that were encased in plastic. They're real bulky. They had big batteries in them. Then you had the handheld transistors. I didn't use those too much, but I remember listening to games on those. You know, I remember laying in bed at 2 o'clock in the morning listening to a Pirates game on KDKA that was being played in Los Angeles. And I had that radio going in my room. There's some static, and my parents got upset. We lived in a small house. We all lived in, on the same level, one level house, about 1,000 square feet, so everybody could hear things. So my sister was next door to me in her bedroom, and it was me with my little radio. So I remember listening as late as 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning to games because I wanted to follow Roberto Clemente so much that I pretty much concentrated on each pitch and listened to the descriptive narratives that these broadcasters presented and try to get a picture of how that would be happening in real life at the ballpark. Looking forward to the next at bat from Roberto Clemente and getting involved in that. My heart rate would go up when he came to bat. No headphones in those days, but I had my ear pretty close to that radio. So I was really into it, and I kept score of games during the broadcasts. I kept score during TV broadcasts. And my dad gave me a tape recorder as a high school gift in 1964 when I graduated. One of those real old, bulky tape recorders with the thin tape, magnetic tapes. I actually recorded games from radio and TV using that old recorder. I would replay them, listen to them a few times. So that was always fun.
Thanks, Dennis, for this story of what baseball and radio has meant to you. In the late 1920s, a broadcaster named Pat Flanagan popularized a new kind of broadcast that swept the nation, called baseball game recreation. This new format allowed millions of fans to connect with the game, fans who otherwise would have been left in the dark. And one of these first recreators was a future president who credited his time in radio for shaping his political toolbox.
It was the ninth inning, the Cards and the Cubs, tied up 0-0. And he was typing, and I thought there's a play coming, and he kept shaking his head when I had, and it was Dean on the mound, and I had Billy Jergis at the plate. And I had him getting his sign from the catcher, and finally here comes the slip of paper, and it said the wires have gone dead.
next time in episode 4 of the Midnight Library of Baseball. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergei Papkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.